Well, I think I've eaten up my time. I think we do have a few minutes for Q&A, so let me stop, and I hope I have offended everybody equally. But I'm open for counters and questions if you have them. So.
Thank you. Tom and I were just noting with each other that the larger theological landscape and culture that our United Methodist seminaries are working in is one that's created a lot of anxiety in terms of the decreasing numbers of students seeking MDivs, et cetera, and it results in a competitive culture among the schools, not a collaborative culture, because the self-interest that you mentioned is one about survival, institutional survival, and so I think that's where a lot of energy gets eaten up and expended, and somehow, I don't know how we intervene in that, but it's a reality on the ground, which you well know.
No, yeah, I'm very aware of that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Russ. This really is wonderful. And it feels like a continuation of the conversation we had in San Diego, which really adds
Absolutely, yes.
a special quality to it.
Yeah.
A book was published in January that I read over our break that describes the issues of higher education in an ecology. We're no longer competing across the Carnegie classifications on the same level. We're now competing with, theological schools are competing with schools like the Maxwell School of Citizenship at Syracuse, or the Corbell School at Denver, or all of those places that are also value laden. And so when anything happens in the higher education environment, it happens to, we used to be immune from some of that, but we're not anymore. And so is this another stage? Is this a stage that's yet to be developed in our history as a church? How would you frame that, where we are right now in this larger ecology, where it's not just theological schools that we're competing with, it's other entities?
I'm not sure I can add really to what you said. I just think that's right. That it's a complex world, and with some of the mega churches doing their own credentialing of persons, and schools that are really not among our 13 launching programming that really is aimed at putting people into professional ministry. There are just so many different avenues now, and making sense of that. And it's easy for those of folks who are in authority to use the quality, priority to try to keep the competition under control. But it's just really hard to think about how creativity and access and innovation it can be held in connection with the viability of institutions in which we have a lot of money. I mean, we have paid for those grounds and buildings and staff, and so it's really hard. Yeah.
Russ, you referred to the traffic patterns between Wofford and Duke. Same thing was true in many of our institutions, right. Millsaps and Birmingham Southern to Candler and so forth. Yeah. And I don't think anyone wants necessarily to recoup that model. But in succeeding generations, we've seen, and I grieve over enormously, separation of church and its institutions. Institutions have lost interest in the church. United Methodist institution lost interest in the church. Church has lost interest in them. Do you think there's any way we can recoup or reestablish some kind of constructive relationship between our colleges and universities and the church, especially in this time of anti-intellectualism and Tea Partyism and so forth?
Well, I'm not optimistic about sort of general outreach to the church, but it does seem to me that boards of ordained ministry ought to be some way of encouraging them to think in more strategic, long-term bases about the well-being of our church and what it means really to have vibrant chaplaincy. I mean, there are a lot of places that got rid of their chaplains, and so you don't really have a United Methodist ethos, in religious ethos there. So I just think, the boards would be certainly one place to start, because things are so conference based in terms of the system, and just to really work at conferences to see, think long term. I mean, years ago, the people who were raised and not raised in religious contexts were given new visions by college chaplaincies, and so came out with a sense of what they might do, whether they went to ministry or not, in local churches. And I still remember a conference years ago at Duke. I don't know whether you were there, and someone remarking on how many of our members of our local church had been to either the Greensboro College or to one of the Methodist institutions. I mean, there's just so much of the leadership, anyway, the leadership of our local church that came out of our colleges. And for a long time, the boards have been just indifferent, if not hostile, to that. And it's just not, it's not thinking strategically ahead. I mean, they're worried about the group that's coming through. That's fine. They have to deal with that. But we just do need to think in more long-term basis about where our leadership is going to come from, lay and clergy. And I mean, Gerald's heard this story before. When I was at Duke, I was going to go down. I had a speaking engagement at Methodist, now a university in Fayetteville. And so I thought, well, I'll just look at the student body and see the divinity body and see who's from there, so I can refer to them when I get down to speak. There was not a soul. There was not a soul at Duke Divinity School at that point from Methodist College. And you think, I mean, what in the world? And, the survival of the colleges, as you all well know, I mean, they have to do programming in so many diverse areas that are not friendly to the liberal arts, and, huge business programs and the like, all of which I think I understand the reason for, but the preparation of persons for ministry, oh man, I won't mention the name because the bishop just recently died, but he was over in Alabama, and when he was, no, he went on as a teaching fellow at our college there, and the enrollment at Emory from there quadrupled, because he would pick people out and said, I think you're called for ministry. And he would say, so, yeah, how are we doing tonight? Yeah.
That's for understanding on the part of the NASCA organization that there is a need for colleges in the Methodist tradition to be more aligned with Methodist values. The leadership of that organization over the last few years has now taken an approach where what we've done is looked at renewing the connection, renewing the connected. And so the presidents at their winter meeting meet with one of the general boards and learn from each other. And then in the summer meeting, this coming summer, I am particularly excited because your collegiate formation stage here, the presidents are actually having an Aspen Institute where we'll be studying Wesley and what does that mean for the presidents at United Methodist institutions. So I'm hoping that what that does is the trickle-down theory, and so leadership of the colleges will start trickling down with more of a Methodist ethos.
Well, I hope so. I mean, I went to that once or twice, and I did have a sense that the presidents were really struggling with it, but it can be mixed. I mean, High Point University is one of the bigger ones in North Carolina now, and if you look at their ads, I mean, they'll go on several pages, they don't mention the United Methodist connection. I thought, man, they could at least footnote it, I mean, it just seems, Kathy's back there.
I got one, yeah. Dr. Richey, thank you, and thank you also for your book. And to broaden it out just a bit, in terms of leadership for the church, the seminary degreed pastor was kind of the gold standard in the early and mid 20th century. And the bulk of the leadership of the church was in local pastors. There's some sense on the thinking of some persons that we may be going back to some of that. And would you comment about, one, do you see that? And if so, what implications does that have for us in providing leadership for the church?
Another big question.
Sorry.
I think that's going to be the case. I do think that GBHEM needs to do everything it can to make sure that the summer programs and weekend programs that the schools often run really do work at quality. I still remember a Methodist colleague at Duke who said that he thought that the course of study produced a better trained person than the MDiv. And I think 3 years is better than 5 months. But I think these programs can be, they've been strong. They need to be, you folks need to keep watch over them and make sure that they're working, because I think that's right. And to me, what the church really needs to do is to fix its, and I hope the ministry study is going to do this. I think people who are appointed in charge of local churches need to be given some kind of elders' orders, if it's temporary or whatever. I think one of the really disgraces is that we have people doing sacraments whom the rest of Christendom really wouldn't recognize as viable. And I say that as a longtime member of the Episcopal United Methodist Dialogue, which is now sort of in hiatus, because I think the Episcopalians have finally realized that we are just so sloppy on things like sacraments and orders. And to me, that would be in keeping with our older tradition of having people who come through and since the course of study or other sort of credentialing, and who are put in charge, so recognized. But I know there are legitimate arguments on all sides. I do hope that folks who are involved in leadership in boards get to see this. I mean, this is not a book for the general Methodist reader. It really is something that has a kind of special audience. But it does seem to me it might help people think, we've been there before. We can think creatively about new systems for dealing with it. Kathy,
I just want to make sure this isn't lost. When you mentioned publishing, for faculty to get tenure, they have to be published.
Right.
Having recently been at the United Methodist Publishing House, I can say for a fact that's not going to happen, or at least very readily. I'm at a more Baptist place now. But I think there is a place for the General Board to do some publishing to help folks get tenure, to help these kinds of books that you've written get out and be distributed. I just didn't want that to fall on deaf ears.
Thanks, yeah. And I do think that you've done a good job, Myron, in putting this out in places so that it gets noticed. So it's gotten good notice. Yeah.
Thanks for pointing out that I broke the rules.
Not knowingly.
No, exactly, absolutely innocently. I wanted to come back to the point about boards of ordained ministry being in closer relationship with the seminaries and vice versa. And to say that I just this week, and maybe Ianther Mills would be the better one to speak to this because she's the one who brought it to my attention, but she, as a graduate of Wesley Seminary, received notice that they are entering into a dialogue along with Drew and Boston and the Northeast Jurisdiction Boards of Ordained Ministry, just to sit down and talk about processes and the relationship between the conferences and the schools that primarily serve that region. And that's very much in the spirit and a good example of what we lifted up as a possibility at the consultation in San Diego about, without any legislation or requirement, just cultivating a relationship between the churches, the conferences, the seminaries, and seeing what comes of that renewed relationship and that renewed dialogue. And I just wanted to lift that up as a sign of hope and as an example that could be done across our jurisdictions. And Episcopal leadership plays a role in that, guiding the boards to do that.
Hi, thank you so much for this lecture. I found it fascinating. I graduated in 2013 from Duke Divinity. And so from a student's perspective, or a recent student's perspective, I found this really neat. I'm curious, I was in the Anglican Episcopal House of Studies, and I even worked for them for a time. And I have a certificate in gender theology and ministry. And because I did disabilities under that, I learned a lot from the theology and medicine certificate programs. So from the perspective of a student, I found the spirit to be very collaborative. I felt like there was a lot of ripples that went from one to the other. I relied very heavily, and even just in my coursework, the most formative professors I had were Willie Jennings, who is Baptist, and Grant Wacker, who is Methodist. And so as an Episcopalian, you know, my formation, the parts of my formation that I felt were most crucial as a lay minister in the Episcopal Church were from non-Anglican professors. Not that I didn't love my Anglican professors. So I'm just curious how much of this, because it does seem like, you know, on your side of it as a professor, it sounds like there is an institutional gap that you're seeing between these initiatives or even between different schools that as a student I didn't feel quite as strongly. And so I'm wondering how we might be able to crowdsource and have this a student-led initiative to fill these gaps and to kind of make these collaborations start working from the student perspective, student-led perspective.
One of the complaints that's sometimes made, not Episcopalians, but of United Methodists, is that they're just not sufficiently initiative-taking. And I think, you know, if you go to any one of our schools, there will be these cohorts, like you described, that function like our old class meetings in terms of, you know, relationships and support, direction, counsel, and the like. So in any one of our schools, you can find certainly subgroups that are functioning in the formational way, often with particular goals in mind. But it's harder for the school as a whole to regularize that process. And so every few years, each school reinvents some kind of first-year course or exposure or, you know, dividing of students to try to regularize that kind of goal orientation, camaraderie, mutual support that helps one, you know, go through the regimens of all the reading and stuff and come out with a strong sense of identity and a purpose and a vocation. So it's not a problem at every place to find the sort of subgroups that are functioning this way. But again, you know, Duke is very highly diverse with the, you know, different sorts of groups. And so, you know, knowing how to find your group, I mean, some people find them right away and through, you know, course focus, and others float through. I mean, you know, I've certainly seen people who's, you know, for whom theological education didn't take. I mean, they were there for their 3 years, and so it's just harder to regularize. But the schools struggle with this and reinvent, particularly the entry program for MDiv students on a regular basis with just your concerns in mind.
Dr. Richey, we have time for one more question.
Okay.
Dr. Richey?
Yeah.
Thank you very much, and I admire your scholarship and contributions to the church and the theological education. Would you please explain a little more about the future of theological education as we globally engage in more online education in higher education? So how do you see the future of theological education in this digital age?
I see it in your lap. No, I mean, I started this last part saying to you what is really the case, and that is I actually have opposed that. I mean, I have really wanted the U.S., us as a denomination, our boards and agencies, and our seminaries to focus on the U.S., and for comparable parts of United Methodism abroad to create analogous institutions that are accountable to their system. So I have actually been, if not vocal, I've been opposed to what I just said. I mean, just what I described here, because I really felt like each culture needs to focus on its own, and I still think the quadrilateral, I mean, the quadrennial, our systems are not helpful. The way we're divided up regionally within the U.S., and so they're just things that seem to me that are not solved when we think globally. The fights within the jurisdictional fights are just you know, put on a global basis. So in some ways, you know, this is an entry into a field that I'm not versed in, that I know that the board here is working on, and I commend you on it. My my point in the lecture was to say that it was, to me, really a discovery to see how much the Divinity School was doing, how well it was funded and staffed, and what a remarkable exercise in doing theological education for contexts and peoples that I didn't think they ought to be about was underway. So your best wishes on it, and thank you very much.